My name is Marie Blackwell, and I'm 54 years old. 3 days ago, I was sitting in my kitchen, still smelling the lingering scent of Thanksgiving turkey, staring at my phone after sending what might have been the most important text of my life. You see, sometimes the hardest lessons we teach are the ones we never planned to give. My daughter told me I was embarrassing her by asking for money she owed me. So I smiled, agreed with her completely, and then did something that changed everything between us forever. Sometimes the best lessons come wrapped in consequences. Before we dive into this story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Are you dealing with something similar in your own family? Please hit that like button if you've ever felt taken advantage of by someone you love, and don't forget to subscribe because I have a feeling this story might help you think differently about the boundaries we set with the people closest to us. Now, let me tell you how 24 hours changed everything. Let me paint you a picture of who I was before this all happened. I've been a widow for 8 years now, ever since my husband David was killed in a car accident that turned my world upside down. David was driving home from his second job, the one he took to help pay for Jessica's college tuition, when a drunk driver ran a red light. In one terrible moment, I lost my partner and became the sole provider for our daughter, who was 18 and just starting her freshman year. I work in accounting for a mid-sized manufacturing company here in Ohio, and let me tell you, a single income doesn't stretch the way two incomes do. After David died, I had to make some hard choices. We sold our four-bedroom house with the big backyard where Jessica had her childhood treehouse and moved into a two-bedroom apartment across town. Jessica cried for weeks about leaving her friends behind, but I explained that sometimes we have to adapt to survive. Those college years were brutal on my finances. I worked my regular job during the day, then cleaned offices 3 nights a week and did bookkeeping for a small restaurant on weekends. I remember falling asleep over tax returns at 2 in the morning, my back aching from the cheap desk chair I'd bought at a thrift store. But I was determined that Jessica would graduate without student loans weighing her down the way they had crushed so many of her friends. Jessica studied marketing at Ohio State and graduated with honors. I was so proud watching her walk across that stage, knowing every sacrifice had been worth it. She landed a job at a decent advertising agency in Columbus, making $45,000 a year, which seemed like all the money in the world compared to what I was scraping together. For the first time since David died, I thought we'd made it through the worst part. She moved into a nice apartment downtown, bought professional clothes with her signing bonus, and started what looked like a promising career. I finally felt like I could breathe again, maybe even start thinking about my own future instead of just surviving each month. I was even considering dating again, something I hadn't thought about since David's funeral. But then the requests started. Nothing dramatic at first, just little emergencies that anyone might face. Her car needed new brakes and she was short $200 until payday. Her laptop died right before a big presentation. Could I help with $500 for a replacement? Each time Jessica promised it was temporary, that she'd pay me back as soon as her finances stabilized. And each time I said yes without hesitation. After all, wasn't this what mothers do? I convinced myself that I was still investing in her future, still being the supportive parent she needed as she navigated her early career. When she called crying about how expensive everything was, how hard it was to make ends meet on an entry-level salary, my heart broke for her. I remembered my own struggles at her age before I met David, when I lived on ramen noodles and couldn't afford a winter coat. So I picked up extra hours at work, skipped meals out with friends, and continued to funnel money to my daughter whenever she asked. It felt natural, like an extension of the sacrifices I'd been making for her since David died. What I didn't realize was that I was creating a pattern that would nearly destroy our relationship. The requests became more frequent, and I started noticing things that didn't quite add up. What began as quarterly emergencies turned into monthly needs, then bi-weekly crises that always seemed to require exactly the amount I could manage to scrape together. Jessica had developed an uncanny ability to ask for just enough that I couldn't say no without feeling cruel, but not so much that I'd panic about my own bills. She'd call with elaborate explanations about unexpected expenses. Her apartment's heating system broke in winter and she needed $800 for emergency repairs. Her dental insurance didn't cover a root canal. Could I help with $600? Someone broke into her car and stole her purse. She needed $400 to replace her phone and credit cards. Each story was detailed and believable, and each time she seemed genuinely distressed. But then I started seeing her social media posts. There was Jessica at a trendy rooftop bar with friends holding cocktails that I knew cost $15 each. Another photo showed her wearing a designer handbag that definitely hadn't come from Target. She posted pictures from weekend trips to Chicago and Nashville, staying in hotels that I couldn't have afforded even when David was alive. The first time I gently asked about these inconsistencies, Jessica became defensive immediately. She told me I was being paranoid that she deserved to have some fun after working so hard. Those trips were group deals, she explained, practically free when split between friends. The handbag was borrowed from her roommate. The cocktails were bought by dates who were trying to impress her. I wanted to believe her explanations because the alternative meant accepting that my daughter was lying to me. So I convinced myself that maybe I was being too suspicious, too controlling. Maybe this was normal for young people these days, and I was just out of touch with how 20-somethings manage their finances. I started tracking my own expenses more carefully, trying to find ways to help Jessica without completely destroying my own financial security. I canceled my gym membership and started walking for exercise instead. I stopped buying name brand groceries and learned to love store brand everything. I postponed the vacation to visit my sister in Florida, something I'd been planning since David died, because Jessica needed help with her student apartment deposit. Then came the day I saw her driving a brand new Honda Civic. She'd traded in her reliable but older Toyota without mentioning anything to me, and when I asked about it during one of our weekly phone calls, she casually mentioned that she'd gotten a great deal on financing. This was the same week she'd borrowed $1,500 from me for what she called emergency medical bills. Something shifted in my chest when I realized she'd taken on a car payment while owing me thousands of dollars. I pulled out a notebook that night and started calculating exactly how much money I'd given Jessica since she graduated college. The number shocked me. $15,000 over 18 months. Money that could have been my emergency fund, my retirement contribution, my chance to finally fix the leaking roof in my apartment. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider the possibility that my generous, loving support was actually enabling behavior that wasn't helping either of us. Jessica wasn't learning to manage her finances because I kept rescuing her from the consequences of her choices. And I wasn't taking care of my own future because I was too busy funding hers. But even with this growing awareness, I wasn't ready to change anything yet. The thought of saying no to my daughter, of letting her struggle when I had the power to help, went against every maternal instinct I'd developed over 26 years. I told myself that she'd mature eventually, that this was just a phase while she adjusted to adult responsibilities. I finally decided we needed to have a real conversation about money, not just the quick exchanges that happened when she called asking for help. I invited Jessica over for dinner on a Sunday evening, planning to approach the subject gently after we'd had a chance to catch up and relax together. I made her favorite meal, chicken parmesan with garlic bread, and set the table with the good dishes we only used for special occasions. When I brought up the money she owed me, Jessica's entire demeanor changed instantly. Her fork stopped halfway to her mouth, and she set it down with the kind of deliberate control that meant she was trying not to explode. "Mom, you're being dramatic," she said, her voice taking on the patronizing tone she'd perfected during her teenage years. "I never said I wouldn't pay you back. I just need time to get established in my career." I tried explaining that I wasn't demanding immediate repayment, just acknowledgement that the money represented a real sacrifice for me. I told her about the vacation I'd canceled, the extra hours I'd been working, the stress I felt every month when my own bills came due. Jessica listened with the kind of fake patience that made it clear she thought I was being ridiculous. "Mom, you don't understand the pressure my generation faces," she said, launching into a speech about student debt, impossible housing costs, and employers who expected entry-level workers to have senior-level experience. "Everyone my age struggles financially. It's not like when you were young and you could buy a house for $20,000. That comment stung more than she probably intended. I wanted to remind her that I'd bought my first house at 32 after years of saving every penny, and that David and I had worked multiple jobs to afford even our modest lifestyle. Instead, I tried to stay focused on the specific issue between us. But Jessica wasn't interested in taking responsibility. Every point I raised was met with an excuse or a deflection. When I mentioned seeing her expensive purchases on social media, she accused me of stalking her online. When I asked about the new car, she said I was being controlling and treating her like a child. The conversation ended with her storming out, leaving me alone with 2 plates of cold chicken parmesan. 3 days later, I discovered that Jessica had used my credit card to make online purchases totaling over $300. She'd kept the card from a time months earlier when I'd asked her to pick up groceries for me while I was sick with the flu. I only found out when I reviewed my monthly statement and saw charges for designer makeup specialty coffee subscriptions and clothing from stores I'd never heard of. When I confronted her about this, Jessica acted like I was making a big deal out of nothing. "You gave me that card to help you," she said. "I just figured it was okay to use it for a few things. I'll pay you back when I get my next paycheck." But her next paycheck came and went without any mention of repayment, and when I brought it up, she looked genuinely surprised that I was still thinking about it. That's when I realized my daughter had become someone I didn't recognize. The grateful, responsible young woman I thought I'd raised had been replaced by someone who felt entitled to my financial support without any obligation to respect my boundaries or acknowledge the sacrifice it required. Jessica had learned that tears and promises would get her whatever she wanted, and I had taught her that my resources were infinite and unconditional. The worst part was recognizing my own role in creating this dynamic. I'd been so afraid of seeming unsupportive, so determined to give her advantages I'd never had, that I'd failed to teach her the value of money and the importance of living within her means. My love had become indistinguishable from enabling, and both of us were paying the price. Thanksgiving arrived with all the weight of unresolved tension between us. I spent 3 days preparing Jessica's favorite dishes, hoping that the familiar comfort of our holiday traditions might create an opportunity for honest conversation. I cleaned my small apartment until it sparkled, bought expensive wine that I couldn't really afford, and set the table with my mother's china that only came out twice a year. Jessica arrived 2 hours late without calling or texting to let me know she was delayed. When she finally showed up, she didn't apologize or explain where she'd been. Instead, she immediately launched into complaints about holiday traffic as if the inconvenience was something happening to her rather than something she'd created by poor planning. She was wearing a new outfit that I recognized from an expensive boutique's website, complete with boots that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Dinner conversation felt forced and superficial. Jessica talked exclusively about drama at her office, detailing conflicts with coworkers and frustrations with her boss in exhausting detail. When I tried to ask about her life outside work, her dating situation, or her plans for the future, she gave short answers and immediately redirected the conversation back to herself and her professional grievances. I waited until we'd finished eating and were clearing the dishes before I brought up the money situation. I'd rehearsed this conversation in my head dozens of times, trying to find words that would be honest but not accusatory, firm but not harsh. I wanted this to be a turning point for us, a chance to rebuild our relationship on a foundation of mutual respect instead of one-sided financial dependency. "Sweetheart, we need to talk about the money you owe me," I said, keeping my voice gentle but serious. "I've been doing some calculating, and between all the loans and help I've given you, the total, that is now $18,500. Jessica's fork clattered against her plate as she dropped it in shock. "Mom, seriously on Thanksgiving?" she said, her voice rising in indignation. "Can't we have one family dinner without you bringing up money like you're some kind of loan shark?" I tried explaining that I wasn't trying to ruin our holiday, but that this amount of money was affecting my ability to pay my own bills and plan for my future. I told her about the credit card debt I'd accumulated covering her emergencies, the retirement contributions I'd missed, the constant stress I felt about my financial security. "I didn't know you were keeping track like some kind of business transaction," Jessica said, her tone mixing hurt with anger. "I thought you were helping me because you love me, not because you expected me to pay you back with interest like a bank." "I do love you," I said, feeling my own patience beginning to fray. "That's exactly why this is so hard for me. I love you enough to have given you $18,000 that I couldn't afford to give. But love doesn't mean I should sacrifice my own financial future so you can live beyond your means." That's when Jessica said the words that changed everything between us. She stood up from the table, her face flushed with anger and embarrassment, and looked down at me with the kind of contempt I'd never seen from her before. "You're embarrassing me with this penny-pinching behavior?" she said, her voice cold and cutting. "I'm your daughter, not some business transaction you need to track and manage. Stop asking me for money. It's pathetic." The silence that followed felt like it lasted forever. I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen, the sound of neighbors watching football through thin apartment walls, the distant traffic of other families probably having normal holiday conversations. Jessica grabbed her purse and jacket, heading toward the door with the dramatic flair she'd perfected during her teenage years. I can't believe you're ruining Thanksgiving over money. She set her hand on the doorknob. This is exactly the kind of thing that makes me not want to come home anymore. The door slammed behind her with enough force to rattle the framed photos on my hallway wall. I sat alone at my dining room table, surrounded by dirty dishes and leftover food, feeling like I'd been physically struck. The apartment felt enormous and empty, filled with the echo of words I couldn't take back, and the smell of a meal that had turned bitter in my mouth. But as I sat there in the ruins of our Thanksgiving dinner, something crystallized in my mind. Jessica had called me pathetic for asking for my own money back. She'd accused me of embarrassing her by expecting basic respect and acknowledgement of the financial help I'd provided. And in that moment of absolute clarity, I realized she was absolutely right about one thing. I was embarrassing myself. That night, after I'd cleaned up the kitchen and put away the leftovers that would feed me for the rest of the week, I picked up my phone and sent a text message to my bank's customer service line. Please remove Jessica Blackwell as an authorized user on all my accounts effective immediately. The morning after Thanksgiving, I woke up feeling clearer than I had in months. I made coffee, sat down with my laptop, and systematically began dismantling the financial safety net I'd built around my daughter's irresponsible choices. I logged into my bank account and removed Jessica's name from my checking account, where I'd added her years earlier in case of emergencies. I called my credit card companies and canceled every card that listed her as an authorized user. I changed the beneficiary on my retirement accounts from Jessica to my sister Linda, at least temporarily, and I called my insurance agent to discuss removing Jessica from my life insurance policy until she could demonstrate some basic financial responsibility. Each phone call felt like taking back a piece of my own life that I'd given away without even realizing it. The process was surprisingly empowering. For years, I'd felt like my financial decisions were tied to Jessica's needs and crises, but now I was making choices based on my own priorities and future security. I opened a new savings account that only I could access and immediately transferred money from my checking account to start rebuilding the emergency fund I'd depleted helping her. Jessica called me at 10:30 that morning, her voice high with panic and confusion. "Mom, my card was declined at the gas station," she said. "Something's wrong with the bank system. Can you call them and fix it?" "Nothing's wrong with the bank system," I said calmly. "I removed you from my accounts last night." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I thought the call had dropped. When Jessica finally spoke, her voice was small and uncertain. "What do you mean you removed me? You told me to stop asking you for money." I explained using the same gentle tone I'd use with a confused child. "I'm respecting your wishes. You said it was embarrassing and pathetic, so I've stopped. You're completely financially independent now, just like you wanted." What followed was a meltdown that would have been impressive if it hadn't been so predictable. Jessica cycled through every emotional manipulation technique she'd ever learned, starting with tears and moving quickly to anger when the tears didn't work. She accused me of destroying our relationship, of being vindictive and cruel, of turning what should have been a normal family disagreement into a nuclear war. "You're being ridiculous," she sobbed into the phone. "I didn't mean you should cut me off completely. I just meant you should stop nagging me about paying you back all the time." "I understand that's what you meant," I said. "But you also called me pathetic for asking. And you know what? You were right. I was embarrassing myself by continuing to enable behavior that wasn't helping either of us." Jessica tried switching tactics, moving from anger to bargaining to guilt within the same conversation. She promised to pay me back immediately, though she couldn't explain where she'd suddenly get $18,000. She apologized for her harsh words, claiming she'd been stressed about work and didn't mean what she'd said. She reminded me of all the sacrifices I'd made for her over the years, as if that somehow obligated me to continue making them forever. When none of that worked, she played her trump card. "Dad would be ashamed of you," she said, her voice quiet and vicious. "He would never have treated me this way. He understood what it means to support your family." That comment should have destroyed me, but instead, it reminded me of something David had said years earlier. Jessica was 16 and had been caught shoplifting makeup from the drugstore. I wanted to ground her and make her work to pay back the store, but I also wanted to minimize the consequences because I was afraid of damaging her self-esteem. David had looked at me seriously and said, Marie, sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let someone face the natural consequences of their choices. If you protect her from everything, you're not preparing her for real life. David would want me to raise a daughter who takes responsibility for her actions. I told Jessica, he would want me to teach you that love doesn't mean enabling destructive behavior. Jessica hung up on me, but not before telling me she never wanted to speak to me again. Over the next 2 weeks, I discovered that Jessica had recruited an entire army of people to pressure me into changing my mind. My sister Linda called confused after receiving a tearful phone call from Jessica about how I'd abandoned her during a financial crisis. My neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, who'd known Jessica since she was little, stopped me in the hallway to express concern about our family problems. Even my coworker, Sarah, mentioned that she'd heard from a mutual friend that I was having issues with my daughter. Each conversation was an opportunity for me to practice explaining my decision calmly and rationally. I discovered that most people, once they heard the full story, were more supportive than I'd expected. Linda admitted she'd always thought I was too generous with Jessica and was proud of me for finally setting boundaries. Mrs. Peterson shared stories about her own adult son who'd learned financial responsibility only after she stopped bailing him out of every crisis. But some people thought I was being too harsh, and their criticism stung. They saw a mother cutting off her struggling young daughter, not understanding the years of enabling that had led to this moment. I had to learn to live with their disapproval while trusting my own judgment about what was best for both Jessica and me. During those 2 weeks of silence, I started seeing a therapist to help process the guilt and fear that came with making such a dramatic change in our relationship. I needed professional help to separate my legitimate concerns for Jessica's well-being from my codependent need to rescue her from every difficulty. The therapist helped me understand that enabling someone's irresponsible behavior is not the same as loving them, even though it often feels like love in the moment. 3 weeks after our disastrous Thanksgiving dinner, Jessica sent me a text message asking if we could meet for coffee. The message was brief and notably free of the drama that had characterized our recent conversations. She suggested a neutral location, a cafe near her office that we'd never been to together, and asked if Saturday afternoon would work for my schedule. I arrived early and chose a table near the window, watching Jessica walk across the parking lot with an expression I couldn't quite read. She moved more slowly than usual without the confident stride that had always been part of her personality. When she sat down across from me, I noticed that her clothes were more subdued than usual, less expensive looking, and she wasn't carrying the designer handbag I'd seen in recent photos. "Mom," she said, her voice quieter than I'd heard it in years. "I owe you an apology." I waited, not wanting to interrupt what seemed like a genuine attempt at taking responsibility. Jessica ordered black coffee instead of her usual complicated drink with multiple modifications, and I wondered if that was a financial decision or just a reflection of her subdued mood. "I've had some time to think about what happened," she continued, "and I realize I've been taking advantage of your generosity. I didn't see it that way at the time because it felt normal, like that was just what mothers do for their daughters. But I can see now that I was asking for way more help than any reasonable person should expect." Her apology felt more genuine than the frantic promises she'd made during our phone call, but I could also hear the careful coaching behind her words. This sounded like an apology designed to get her access to my credit cards again, not necessarily a fundamental change in how she viewed our relationship or her own responsibilities. "I appreciate you saying that," I said carefully. "Can you help me understand what's changed in the last few weeks?" Jessica's composure cracked slightly, and for a moment I saw genuine vulnerability instead of calculated contrition. "My rent is due in 3 days, and I don't have enough money," she admitted. "I've been living paycheck to paycheck for months using your help to cover the difference between what I earned and what I spent. Without that safety net, I'm looking at real consequences for the first time." She went on to explain that she'd been forced to look seriously at her spending habits and had been shocked by what she found. The daily coffee shop visits, the regular shopping trips, the expensive dinners with friends, the impulse purchases that seemed small individually but added up to hundreds of dollars every month. She'd never tracked her expenses before because she knew I would cover any shortfalls. "I want to make things right between us," Jessica said. "I know I can't pay you back immediately, but I can start with a payment plan if you'll work with me." I felt my maternal instincts pulling me toward immediate forgiveness and restoration of our previous arrangement. Every part of me wanted to fix her current crisis and return to the familiar dynamic where I was the rescuer and she was the grateful daughter. But I'd learned enough in therapy to recognize this as a crucial testing moment. I love you, and I want to rebuild our relationship, I said. But I won't provide any more money. If you want to work out a repayment plan for what you already owe me, I'm willing to discuss that. But the days of me funding your lifestyle are over permanently. Jessica's face cycled through disappointment, anger, and what looked like panic before settling on something resembling acceptance. So, what happens if I can't make my rent? She asked. Then you'll face the same consequences any adult faces when they can't pay their bills, I said gently. You'll have to figure out solutions that don't involve me rescuing you. The conversation that followed was difficult but necessary. Jessica tried several times to negotiate exceptions to my new boundaries, suggesting emergency funds or one-time assistance for specific crises. Each time I calmly but firmly redirected her toward finding solutions that didn't involve my money. It was like teaching a child to walk by, refusing to carry them, painful to watch, but necessary for their development. When we parted ways that afternoon, our relationship felt tentative and fragile, built on a new foundation that neither of us was entirely comfortable with yet. But for the first time in months, I felt like I was talking to my daughter as an adult rather than managing her as a dependent child. The year that followed was filled with both progress and setbacks as Jessica slowly adapted to life without my financial safety net. She found a roommate to split her rent, started buying generic groceries instead of name-brand everything, and learned to cook basic meals instead of ordering takeout multiple times a week. These changes didn't happen overnight or without resistance, but necessity proved to be an effective teacher when I wasn't available to cushion the consequences of poor choices. There were moments when Jessica reverted to old patterns, calling me in tears about financial emergencies and expecting immediate rescue. Each time I had to practice saying, "That sounds really stressful. What options are you considering?" instead of asking how much money she needed. These conversations were heartbreaking, but they forced Jessica to develop problem-solving skills she'd never needed while I was handling her crises. 6 months after our coffee shop meeting, Jessica got a second job working evenings at a retail store. She complained bitterly about having to work weekends and giving up her social life. But I noticed a subtle change in how she talked about money. Instead of treating it as an abstract concept that would somehow appear when needed, she started discussing specific dollar amounts and making deliberate choices about how to spend her limited resources. She downloaded a budgeting app and started tracking her expenses, something she'd always claimed was too complicated and time-consuming to bother with. She discovered that her coffee shop habit was costing her over $150 a month, and she made the decision to buy a coffee maker for her apartment instead. These small victories felt enormous to me because they represented Jessica taking responsibility for her own financial well-being. Our relationship during this period was strained but slowly improving. We talked less frequently than before, partly because Jessica was busier with her 2 jobs, and partly because our conversations no longer revolved around her latest crisis. When we did talk, the conversations felt more balanced, with Jessica asking about my life and showing interest in things other than her own immediate needs. The previous Thanksgiving, almost exactly 1 year after our disastrous dinner, Jessica called me early in the morning. "Mom," she said, her voice serious but warm, "I want to host Thanksgiving this year. I know my apartment is small, but I'd like to cook for you for once." I was so surprised that I couldn't immediately respond. Jessica had never cooked a full meal in her life, and the idea of her taking on the complexity of a holiday dinner seemed almost impossible. But there was something in her voice that convinced me she was serious about this gesture. Her apartment was indeed small, barely big enough for the card table she'd set up for our meal. The turkey was slightly dry and the mashed potatoes were lumpy, but Jessica had clearly put enormous effort into creating a special occasion. She'd bought flowers for the table and used cloth napkins instead of paper ones, small touches that showed she understood the importance of making our time together feel significant. During dinner, Jessica brought up our previous Thanksgiving without prompting. "I owe you a real apology for what I said that night," she said. "I called you pathetic for asking for your own money back, and that was cruel and ungrateful. You weren't embarrassing yourself. I was embarrassing myself by taking advantage of your love." This apology felt fundamentally different from the one she'd offered months earlier at the coffee shop. This wasn't strategic or calculated, but a genuine acknowledgement of how her behavior had affected both of us. She went on to thank me for cutting her off financially, something I'd never expected to hear. I was angry at the time, but you saved me from myself, she said. I was becoming someone I didn't like, someone who felt entitled to things I hadn't earned. Learning to live within my means has been hard, but it's also made me proud of myself in a way I'd never felt before. Jessica had started a systematic plan to pay back the money she owed me, sending $50 every month, along with a note updating me on her progress toward financial independence. She'd also opened her first savings account and was building an emergency fund so she'd never again be completely dependent on someone else's financial support. The conversation over dinner was the most honest and mature discussion we'd ever had about money responsibility and the difference between helping someone and enabling them. Jessica asked thoughtful questions about my own financial goals and seemed genuinely interested in learning from my experiences rather than just taking advantage of my resources. Looking back now, almost 2 years since that terrible Thanksgiving dinner, I can see how fundamentally our relationship has changed and grown. The financial crisis that nearly destroyed our connection ultimately became the foundation for building something stronger and more honest between us. Jessica has not only learned to manage her own money responsibly, but has developed a sense of pride and self-reliance that she'd never experienced while I was constantly rescuing her from the consequences of her choices. The process of healing wasn't just about Jessica learning financial responsibility. It was also about me learning to separate love from enabling. I had to work through my own guilt and fear about letting my daughter struggle, recognizing that my need to rescue her was sometimes more about my own anxiety than her actual needs. Therapy helped me understand that protecting someone from every difficulty isn't the same as loving them, and that true support sometimes looks like stepping back and allowing natural consequences to teach lessons that no amount of money can provide. My own financial situation has improved dramatically since I stopped funding Jessica's lifestyle. I've rebuilt my emergency savings account, increased my retirement contributions, and even started planning that trip to visit my sister that I'd postponed for years. For the first time since David died, I'm making financial decisions based on my own goals and security rather than constantly responding to someone else's crisis. The holidays this past year were a revelation. Jessica not only insisted on paying for our dinner out, but chose a restaurant within her budget rather than expecting me to cover the difference for somewhere more expensive. She gave me a thoughtful gift that she'd clearly saved for, and when I tried to give her money for Christmas as I had in previous years, she politely declined and suggested we start a new tradition of giving each other experiences instead of cash. Our conversations now cover topics we'd never discussed when our relationship was dominated by financial transactions. Jessica tells me about her work projects, her goals for career advancement, and her plans for eventually buying a small house. She asks for my advice about these plans not because she wants me to fund them, but because she values my experience and perspective as someone who's navigated similar challenges. The most surprising development has been Jessica's relationship with money itself. She's become almost frugal in some ways, taking genuine pleasure in finding good deals and making smart financial choices. She clips coupon shops at thrift stores and has learned to cook elaborate meals from inexpensive ingredients. These aren't skills she developed because I taught them to her, but because necessity forced her to learn them when my money was no longer available to cover her poor planning. 6 months ago, Jessica was promoted to a senior position at her company with a salary increase that finally allows her to live comfortably without working 2 jobs. Her first impulse was to upgrade her lifestyle immediately, but she caught herself and decided to continue living modestly while she built up her savings account and paid off the last of what she owed me. I don't want to go back to feeling financially insecure, she told me during one of our weekly phone calls. Having money in the bank feels better than having expensive things I can't really afford. This shift in her relationship with money and security has affected every area of her life. She's more confident at work because she's not constantly stressed about bills. Her friendships are healthier because she's no longer resentful about not being able to keep up with friends who have more disposable income. Even her dating life has improved because she's attracted to partners who share her values about financial responsibility rather than those who enable or expect irresponsible behavior. The hardest part of this journey for me was learning to trust that Jessica could handle difficulties without my immediate intervention. Every time she faced a challenge, my instinct was still to offer financial help or to solve her problems for her. Learning to ask, "What are you thinking of doing about that?" instead of "How much money do you need?" required constant conscious effort and regular reminders from my therapist about the importance of allowing adult children to develop their own coping skills. But watching Jessica successfully navigate challenges on her own has been more rewarding than any gratitude she ever expressed for my financial help. When her car needed major repairs last year, she researched her options, got multiple estimates, and chose to fix her current car rather than taking on debt for a newer one. When a friend asked to borrow money from her, Jessica kindly but firmly declined, explaining that she'd learned the importance of maintaining clear financial boundaries. These moments showed me that Jessica had truly internalized the lessons that my cutting her off had forced her to learn. She wasn't just following rules I'd imposed or temporarily modifying her behavior to regain access to my money. She had developed her own understanding of financial responsibility and its connection to self-respect and independence. The relationship we have now is built on mutual respect rather than financial dependency. When Jessica visits, she brings groceries and cooks dinner for both of us. When I visit her, she plans activities within her budget rather than expecting me to fund expensive entertainment. We've learned to show love and care for each other through time and attention rather than money and rescue operations. I often think about other parents who might be struggling with similar situations with their adult children. The pressure to help, especially when you have the means to do so, can feel overwhelming. Society tells us that good parents sacrifice for their children, but there's little discussion about when that sacrifice becomes harmful to both generations. My advice to other parents facing similar challenges is to examine honestly whether your help is actually helping. Are you teaching your adult children to be self-reliant and responsible, or are you enabling them to avoid the natural consequences that would teach them important life skills? It's possible to love someone deeply while still requiring them to take responsibility for their own choices and their own financial well-being. The most loving thing I ever did for Jessica was refusing to continue rescuing her from the predictable results of her financial irresponsibility. It felt cruel at the time, both to her and to me, but it gave her the opportunity to develop capabilities and confidence she never would have gained while I was solving all her problems for her. Our relationship today is stronger, more honest, and more balanced than it ever was when it was built around my role as financial provider and her role as grateful recipient. We're both better people because I finally learned that true love sometimes requires letting people face consequences, and Jessica finally learned that self-reliance feels better than dependency. If you're watching this and recognizing your own family dynamics, I want you to know that it's never too late to change patterns that aren't serving anyone well. It might feel impossibly difficult to stop rescuing someone you love, but sometimes the most compassionate choice is to step back and allow them to discover their own strength. I'd love to hear about your experiences with setting financial boundaries in your own family. Have you ever had to make a difficult choice between helping someone you love and enabling behavior that wasn't helping them grow? Please share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video if it gave you something to think about. Subscribe to hear more stories about the complicated dynamics of family relationships and the sometimes surprising ways that love shows up in our lives. Share this video with anyone who might be struggling with similar decisions, because sometimes we all need to hear that it's okay to love someone enough to let them learn hard lessons on their own. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that the strongest relationships are built on mutual respect and responsibility, not one-sided sacrifice. I hope your own family relationships continue to grow stronger and more honest, even when that growth requires difficult conversations and painful changes. Take care of yourselves and take care of each other.